Antony Loewenstein is a Jewish, Australian, German freelance investigative journalist, author, and filmmaker. Antony is also the author of many books, his latest being The Palestine Laboratory: How Israel Exports the Technology of Occupation Around the World. Antony, welcome to On the Line.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining me. I've been wanting to speak to you for a long time. Right after I got your book and started reading about things that I had no idea about, like really no idea about. And I am someone who I thought knew a lot about this issue. But we'll get into the book a bit later. But last month I was speaking to the director of Israelism, Aaron Axelman, and Simone Zimmerman, who's one of the protagonists in there, the co-founder of Independent Jewish Voices. And they were talking to me about sort of the trajectory of their lives and how they came to the conclusion that really their peace or anything to come to until there is an end to occupation. And I'm just wondering how you got there, how you came to that conclusion.
A similar trajectory. I mean, briefly, I was born in Australia in the mid-70s, and when you grow up in most Jewish homes, I would say then, but also now, with some exceptions, Israel is something which is said to be central to our lives. It wasn't bashed over the head. I wasn't going to Israel every year. I wasn't marching in the street with an Israeli flag. It was nothing like that. But there was a sense that because my family, many of whom had been killed in the Holocaust, the ones who had escaped came to Australia, Canada, the US, etc. And therefore the idea that I was told from a young age was that Israel was a safe haven. God forbid something happens to us as Jews. Most listeners might know this, but as a Jew I can go to Israel tomorrow, and within a relatively short amount of time, if I can prove that I'm Jewish, namely my mother is Jewish, or I've converted in a very Orthodox Jewish way, I can become a citizen and get a passport, essentially. Now, I've never done that, just to be clear. I'm not an Israeli citizen. But that feeling of a safe haven was central to me or my family when I was growing up. And really, until I was a teenager, I didn't overly question it, not because I was a big believer in Israel, but I just didn't have the knowledge. And also, let's be honest, I don't know how old you are, Samir, but I grew up before the internet. And that, I think, radically changes how we view the world. It just does. So I guess I was ignorant, principally. And I have often said to people, I don't think I met a Palestinian until my 20s. It's possible I did, but there was so little interaction between the Jewish community and Palestinians. It is changing a little bit, thank God. But even now, there is this real encouragement of tribalism. It's us or them. And unless we, as Jews, as Israel, are strong meaning a massive military or occupation, whatever it may be, we will be killed. I mean, this logic is repeated over and over again. So I got to my teenage years, started reading a bit more, and started hearing real open racism amongst my family, amongst the synagogue where I grew up, against Arabs. It seemed irrational to me. It was based on this idea that they all want to kill us. Yasser Arafat was then the leader of the Palestinians. He, so I was told, was directing suicide bombers. Again, it was us and them. They're brutal, they're ugly. And I was told Palestinians are the new Nazis. I heard that all the time.
Growing up,
they're the new Nazis. I'm not saying for my mother and father particularly, but within the larger family. They're the new Nazis. Arafat is Hitler. And until I got to my 20s, went to university in Melbourne, which is the second biggest city in Australia, I started reading much more and started learning, again, mostly before the internet, a bit more about the lies that I had been told about the establishment of Israel, about what Israel was. This was in the early to mid-90s. The occupation then had already been going for 30-odd years. But the idea that Palestinian lives would be equal to mine was just an anathema in much of the Jewish community. So it was a long process. And then very, very briefly, I went to Israel-Palestine for the first time in 2005. I was researching my first book, My Israel Question. And when I read back that book then, it ended up being this massive bestseller, which was lovely and satisfying on one level. But on the other hand, the message that I was saying is not one I share now. I believe in a Jewish state. two-state solution. It was an incredibly mild, moderate book. It was challenging the Israel lobby, and the Israel lobby in Australia and elsewhere lost their mind. I was condemned in Parliament. It was insane. Insane. And my views have evolved a lot since then. And since then, I've been to Israel, Palestine every 3 or 4 years. And between 2016 and 2020, I lived there with my partner. She worked for an international NGO, and I was doing journalism, and I've been to Gaza many times and written many books. So I guess my evolution, although it's different to what's in Israelism in a way, because obviously that's particularly in the US, not massively different to that almost coming out. And therefore, just finally, still to this day, are seen by many in the establishment Jewish community as a complete traitor. I'm a traitor to the cause. This is long before October 7. Long before October 7.
The cause being Israel?
The cause being Israel, the cause being, sure, you can criticize Israel if you must, but do it in closed doors. Don't
air out dirty laundry.
Don't air. Yeah. Exactly. And I often said when I heard this the first time 30 years ago, are you seriously telling me, Jewish community, in Australia there's around 100,000 Jews, so it's a pretty small community really, are you seriously saying, Jewish community, that the community is so weak that we can't have a robust conversation about what Israel's doing in my name, which is, by the way, funded, yes, by the US, but also Jewish communities around the world? I thought that was insane at the time, and even more so now.
It's interesting, because in my sort of history and trajectory, as an Iranian, I was always told that it was Palestinians that caused the revolution, in 1979. And there's that, photo of Arafat coming to visit Khomeini right after the revolution. And that was sort of what I was brought up with, right? Palestinians did this, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with Iranians just not wanting to take responsibility for anything they ever do. It's either the Americans, the British, and now the Palestinians. But in the introduction to your book, The Palestine Laboratory, you wrote that my evolution in the last 20 years mirrors the growing global awareness of what Israel has been and where it's headed. And you talk about how this public debate around this shift has been occurring since the 2000s. Can you take me through that a bit, sort of what you've been seeing?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the caveat to that comment in the book, I can't remember if I write this in the introduction, is that obviously Palestinians have been well aware for decades what's happening and what Israel's doing to them, of course. I think I'm talking there, if I recall correctly, in terms of the debate both publicly in the media but also in the Jewish community.
Yes,
if you
ask, facts on the ground.
And the facts on the ground.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, there's been an occupation, I would argue, since 1948. Of course, it accelerated in 1967. It's been over half a century. But the reality of what's going on, the sheer, I would argue, permanence of what's happening, the brazenness of the Jewish supremacy, which is now in the heart of the Netanyahu government. Not, I think, Netanyahu, as I've often said for the last years, the problem in Israel is not Netanyahu, just as a brief aside. He's a horrible leader. This is not a defense of him by any means. But the problem in Israel is not Netanyahu. If he gets replaced tomorrow, the majority of likely successors to him have remarkably similar views about Palestinians, about occupation. It's the Israeli public who have been radicalized. And I think that that's mirrored in much of the global Jewish community, that as Israel has become more extreme in the last decades, its most belligerent advocates in the West have also had to become more extreme with it. More fascist? Sure. More occupation? Sure. Genocide in Gaza? Sure. Whatever it takes. Whatever it takes to keep us safe. At the same time, and I think the internet has played a central role in this in the last 20 or so years, 25 years, it's much easier now for much of the world, including the Jewish community, to know what's going on. There are Palestinians in the West Bank, in Gaza, or elsewhere. I mean, frankly, since October 7, the only vision that we are seeing from Palestine or Gaza is coming from Palestinians. There are no foreign journalists in there, which I think is outrageous, by the way, but nonetheless, that's the reality. So there is an ability now, there's no excuse anymore to not know what is happening in Palestine. And I think in the Jewish community, particularly young Jews, and this is based not just on my opinion, but public opinion polling in the US and elsewhere, my country, Australia, and I think your country too, many young Jews, not all, but many young Jews increasingly do not accept what their parents and grandparents and rabbis say, that our duty as Jews is to be a propagandist for Israel. Our duty is to believe, as I do, a belief that we do not want to live in a Jewish supremacist state. We live in a country, Australia, Canada, America, with all its faults. I'm not idealising any of those nations. There's a multiculturalism, not perfect, full of problems, there's lots of racism, I'm not denying any of that, but Israel is literally the opposite of that. It is a Jewish supremacist.
That's not how it shows itself, right? I mean,
absolutely.
Like, when you talk to people, when people who are very pro-Israeli, they talk about how multicultural it is and how people from Yemen, and we have Ethiopians and this, and they even push back on this idea that it's an ethno-nationalist state.
They do. I mean, look, are there Jews from all over the world in parts of Israel? Yes, there are. There's obviously various Jews who came over the decades from many Arab states. That's true. But the reality is you cannot be a multi-ethnic democracy as Israel claims to be. And I might add, they're not claiming it within Israel itself. They're claiming it through their hasbara, through their public so-called diplomacy, what they're trying to sell to the world. And I think increasingly there is a realization amongst the Israeli political elites and frankly the media that argument has been lost, that so-called liberal Jews, I'm generalizing here, Israel for them is gone. They're not going to be full advocates. What these more hardline pro-Israel types do see as allies are, say, Republicans in America, obviously some Democrats to be sure, or evangelicals. And I've been saying for a long time that I think if the vision of many hardline Zionist Jewish supremacists is to have 1 million, 2 million settlers in the West Bank, which is what the vision is long term, the only way that can happen is if you start bringing in non-Jews, namely evangelicals. There aren't enough Jews in the world who want to go and live in some crazy Wild West apartheid system. There are some who can be induced by cheap housing, to be sure, but not millions. There's only, 15, 16 million Jews in the world. I mean, that's it. It's a small population. So the idea of having, can you imagine, which is already happening, by the way, on a small scale, evangelicals moving to the West Bank, and obviously they're not Jewish, but they're fully signed up to the Zionist project. And I think that increasingly is where Israel will find its support, and the global far right. As I talk about in my book, and this has become even clearer in the last year or so, that as much of the global left has basically let Israel go, the left in Germany, the so-called left in Germany, is a much more complicated picture, but putting Germany aside for a minute, the global far right and the right in Europe fully signed up to Israel. In fact, the more Palestinians who are killed, the better. And those groups are in the ascendancy politically in many European states. And frankly, the US, if Trump wins, which is obviously very possible, who knows, come November, those groups are empowered by what Israel is doing. And in fact, the last year, since October 7, have been happy with how Israel is responding in Gaza. They're not against it. They encourage more bloodshed, more killing, because Palestinians for them are not human beings, are not equal citizens. So I think we need to be cautious in parts of the left when we see undeniably massive global civil society rising up against Israel, what it's doing. That's undeniably true, and it's about harnessing that to put more pressure on Israel. But there's many parts of the world, from the European far right to India, which is the world's biggest country, who are full on, who are 110% in bed with Israel, right? I mean, this struggle is going to go on.
You spoke about the far right, and there's a quote in the book from the alt-right leader Richard Spencer, and I found it quite chilling, where you said, Jews are once again at the vanguard, rethinking politics and sovereignty for the future, showing a path forward for Europeans. You point out that he made that statement right after Israel's nation-state law was formalized. For people who don't know, what is the nation-state law?
The nation-state law, which came in place, I think, 2017 or 18, have to be one of those years, I forget exactly, which essentially codified that Israel was officially, I mean, arguably it had been this way the whole time, a Jewish state. The Jews were the so-called rightful owners of the land. Hebrew was the only right and premier language, Arabs, Palestinians, Arabic as a language was secondary, essentially. And in some ways it really made it official what was pretty clear since 1948. And the reason I think people like Spencer, and frankly much of the global far right, looks to Israel with admiration as a model is that that's what they want to create in their own countries, obviously not Jews but Christians, or why Hindu fundamentalists in India very much admire what Israel is doing, because for them, they want to build an ethno-nationalist state. Which country on this planet has essentially done that, inverted commas, successfully for nearly 80 years with no real international sanction, frankly? It's Israel, a country of 9-10 million people. If you add the occupation, about 14-15 million. It's a tiny country. And yet the model that Spencer and others see in Israel is a country that doesn't care about, I mean, Israel claims they're multicultural, but essentially they basically prioritise Jews. It's a proudly Jewish supremacist state. That if you are not Jewish, you are not an equal citizen. I'm not even talking about just in Palestine. This is also the case in Israel proper. Yes, Israeli Arabs can vote, but they are massively discriminated against in terms of health and education and other realities of daily life. So this model of Israel as an ethno-nationalist ideal is growing in stature in many countries, and I worry that many people have their fingers in their ears to not recognise that. In the last year, since October 7, has not changed that idealism of many in the global far right. They support what Israel is doing in Gaza. They think it's fantastic. More killing, please. That's how they view it. And it worries me that those groups in some countries, France, Italy, Sweden, are either in power or potentially on the path towards power.
The reason I said it was chilling also was because that vanguard of civilization, that sentence, was something that was repeated by Gilad Erdogan, the UN ambassador, the Israeli ambassador to the UN. And that I was wondering what you thought of that speech, his exit speech that he made, where he said Israel is the vanguard of civilization.
We are today the vanguard of civilization. We are the vanguard of civilization. But until then, Am Israel Chai. Thank you, Mr. President.
You know, and I started looking into this guy. I had never heard of him before, and then I noticed, oh my God, in 2016 he was, the minister of this, and then he did the minister of that, and he's hoping to become. I read somewhere he's hoping to become prime minister.
Well, stranger things have happened, right? Who knows in that country? I mean, what he represents for many people when they see him, they regard his words as this kind of extreme, clownish behaviour. Like, sorry. I think he said last week in some interview, my view of the UN, it should be burnt down, or just sort of. But that extremism to your and my ears is extremely mainstream in Israel. And this is, I guess, what I think a lot of people, and frankly much of the Western press, has not particularly about him per se, but in general,
they ignore it.
They ignore it. There is a sense of it's sort of inverted commas normal to write and talk about, there's extremists in Iran or Saudi or other countries. And yes, there are. Of course, there are extremists in Iran. You'd know that better than anyone. Or other countries. Yes, that's true. But there are also not just a handful of extremists in Israel. Jesus, there was a poll 2 weeks ago that found the majority of Israelis thought that people who had raped a Palestinian prisoner should basically just be let off.
Yeah.
It's a minor detail. I mean, the guy who allegedly committed the rape, he was on Israeli TV as a hero. Now, every country has rape culture. Horrifically. Your country does, mine. I'm well aware of that. But I do not know, and correct me if I'm wrong, another country, a so-called Western country like Israel, a self-described Western country like Israel, that basically proudly displays a proud rapist as sort of a celebrity.
As a jokester.
Now, I guess you could argue that someone like Trump is also an alleged rapist and could be president in 3 months. But, apart from him and his example. But, I mean, Israeli society itself has been radicalised. This is, I think, what a lot of people don't want to see. That not every Israeli, there are very progressive Israelis who are fighting for a just future. I know some of them, maybe you do too, and I'm deep admiration of them. But they're a tiny minority. And without outside pressure, this will not change. The change will not come there from within. Tragically, it won't.
Unfortunately, even in the media landscape here in Canada, because I was covering the encampments at the University of Toronto, which was one of the longest encampments in North America. And Independent Jewish Voices was there, Jewish Faculty Network. They were all, inside. They were holding Shabbat dinners there every Friday. And the media was ignoring these voices, and the reason when I would ask, even some of my friends, former colleagues, I would say, why aren't you talking to these people? Say, they're the minority, they're the outliers. And so all the people that were getting the airtime were the people coming outside the encampment screaming, calling these, teenagers rapists and Hamas supporters and all that. I mean, I want to ask you about the role of the media and mass atrocity, because you've written about this before.
Yeah, a lot.
What sort of, how is the media failing right now? I mean,
how long do you have?
Yeah.
We've got a couple of hours just to go through that.
Yeah.
I mean, look, like with any conversation around the media, there's good journalists and good outlets doing good work. Of course there are. Even in a lot of the corporate press, there's good journalists. The New York Times, of course there are. The Post, the Wall Street Journal even. But in general, there is a deference to power. That a lot of journalists, if you speak to them, they'll say, my job is to, if they're honest, is to challenge power. Okay, sure, which I think that is your role if you're being honest. But the fact is, most, in my experience as foreign correspondents or journalists who are based in the US, Canada, Australia, wherever, they want to be close to power. Whether it's a politician or a business leader, or they see their role as if they are not close to powerful person X, they won't get the stories that allow them to continue in that role. Access journalism, you can be a so-called access journalist. I mean, you could argue someone like Seymour Hersh had lots of access for decades. His work is principally off the record people in positions of power talking about horrific crimes from the US to Vietnam to the Middle East. Obviously, I think someone like Hersh is very critical and skeptical of power, but he was close to power. The question is what you do with that power. And I think when it comes to Israel-Palestine, there is, I think, still this real reluctance and uncomfortableness to view and frame Jews as extremists. It is so easy, particularly since 9/11, to frame, and yes, of course there are Muslim extremists. Of course there are, in multiple countries, obviously, from ISIS to Iran to elsewhere. Of course that's true. But there is, I think, still a reluctance to say, as you would say about Iran. Well, Iran is full of, for example, full of crazy mullahs. And yes, there are a lot of crazy mullahs in Iran, thank you very much. But there's also a lot of citizens, some who support them and some who don't, and it's a complex picture, sure. But in Israel, I would argue, in the evidence, it's not just an opinion, Israeli society and Jewish diaspora society have been radicalized by Zionism in support of a deeply Jewish supremacist project. And I think many in the media, as I speak to them regularly, are scared to engage with that. Oh, I'm going to be accused of anti-Semitism, or I'm going to talk about Jewish power, which plays into stereotypes. And yes, one has to be careful how you talk about it and write about it. And I often say that if a journalist says, oh, person X in the encampment is a fringe figure or is represented by 4 people, my response would be, let's say it's one person. So it's one person against genocide and 1,000 who support genocide. Okay, well, who do you want to speak to? Sure, speak to the pro-genocide people if you want to get the so-called both sides. But at what point do you make a judgment? And let's be honest, when it comes to Russia, Ukraine, the media was very clear very quickly what was going on there, right? Russia was the aggressor, which I think they were. They invaded Ukraine. Ukraine is fighting for its existence. We can argue about how that war has gone on now or not at all. But it was pretty clear. I remember stories of Ukrainians making Molotov cocktails that they were going to throw against Russian troops. Now, we can agree with that or not. Can you imagine a story in a sort of dispassionate way about Palestinians in the West Bank or Gaza doing that? If the story existed, they'd be terrorists, which therefore gives justification to Israel to kill them, so the logic goes. So I think there is still not just a reluctance, it's a gutlessness. But ultimately, they're digging their own grave because, yes, I do think it's important that variety of outlets exist. I don't want the world just to be Instagram. I think that would be a very problematic thing. I mean, I use it all the time like you do. But there needs to be kind of well-researched journalism, which can exist on Instagram, but obviously exists also in the mainstream press. But the fact that on issues like Palestine, so much of the media is willfully failing and not viewing, for example, killed Palestinian journalists in Gaza with the same reverence as they do with journalists being killed in, say, Ukraine or elsewhere. That somehow, well, they're Palestinian, Israel says they're terrorists, who's to say?
Trust them.
We can't trust Israel. And the idea that in 2024 we're still taking the IDF's word as gospel blows my mind. Do we take what the Kremlin says as gospel? Do we take, frankly, we shouldn't, what the State Department or Pentagon says as gospel? I mean, if you do, you're an idiot. And we shouldn't take what the IDF says as gospel. I think there is and finally, let's be honest, there's also deep racism against Arabs, Palestinians and Muslims in our media. It's been the case long before 9/11. It's certainly continued after 9/11. It's got in some ways worse since October 7. There is a deep distrust, contempt, hatred, ignorance about many in the Muslim, Arab, Palestinian community on a range of issues, whether it's Palestine, terrorism, Islamophobia, whatever it is. And often over the years, people have said to me, particularly in the Muslim community globally, thank you for being our voice about these issues. And that's often made me a little bit uncomfortable. First, I say, okay, it's lovely, thank you very much. I take it, it's meant in a lovely way, of course. But it sort of saddens me because I know those people probably would be not happier, but as happy if there were more prominent Muslim commentators, writers, journalists, which of course exist, but not nearly enough, given the platform to speak on Palestine or whatever it may be. So I'm under no illusion that sometimes critical Jews are given, not always, but sometimes a platform to speak, whereas a so-called critical Muslim is often not.
Yeah, I've noticed we always put the Palestinians on the air, at least in the Canadian media landscape, to ask them how they're feeling. It's, how are you feeling? You haven't eaten today. How does that feel? Oh, your entire family died. How you doing? It's never to provide analysis. None of that expertise. It's always stuck in the how you doing.
Well, I think that's changed. I can't speak for Canada, but I think it's changing in some Western countries. I think, for example, in the US, and again, not to defend the American media, you do at least hear some Palestinian voices, which honestly you would not have heard 20, 30 years ago. You wouldn't have. And I think, interestingly enough, it's remarkable to think that young people's opinion has radically changed on this, not because of the mainstream media, but despite it. So the question often is, well, why are so many young Americans, for example, 18 to 35, based on polling before October 7 and certainly since, increasingly supportive of Palestine? This is freaking out the Jewish establishment, it's freaking out the Democrats.
Get rid of TikTok.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Let's get rid of TikTok. Now, I'm not a big fan of TikTok, but really, you're going to get rid of TikTok because the kids support Palestine? Really? Okay, good luck with that.
But it's not TikTok. I've spoken to these young kids. Okay, I don't want to date myself. I'm 49 now, but I've spoken to them.
Oh my God, we are literally the same age.
I spoke to them inside the encampment. They're very well read. They are
Absolutely.
Very well versed on this history, and they've gone and done their own research. And I think that's what is scaring a lot of people.
Yes, and of course the last 11 months has shown that you are live streaming horrific massacres and genocide in a way that has not been the case for really any other war in modern times. I fear that this kind of way of covering war will become the norm, that we have all the information we need and yet the war is not stopping. In other words, I'm someone who believes that information is power. That's sort of self-evident, and yet we have the information, we know what's going on, and yet virtually every Western country, I'm talking about leadership, is not changing their policy. They're not.
It's funny you said that. It reminded me of watching that interview recently with Sky News, David Menser, who was on, and the journalist was talking about the fact that no foreign journalist could get in. And he was saying, well, we have to keep them out. But he said, you're seeing everything. Don't pretend you're not seeing it. You're seeing everything. So it was almost this sort of, we know that you're seeing all these things on Instagram. We know that those Palestinian journalists are there. We know we're killing them. But
he also said in the interview that he says, I know we're losing the PR war.
yes, that's right.
Now, of course, the PR war is important, obviously. I mean, ultimately, what's more important, stopping the damn war or losing the PR war? I mean, let's stop the war. And it seems to me at the moment, obviously, I mean, hopefully this changes in a matter of days or weeks, that there seems to be no real interest in stopping the war. I'm talking about from the Israeli side or the American side, despite the sort of hapless Antony Blinken who kind of gets trotted out like a wax figure kind of travelling from Middle East capital to others. I mean, everyone knows what's going on here. I sort of compare it to what happened during Oslo in a way, that Oslo was to some extent a sham because it went on and on and on for years with the illusion of negotiations, while at the same time the occupation was getting bigger and deeper and more entrenched. Now obviously...
And that's what they're doing right now with the ceasefire,
yes,
this sort of
yes,
ceasefire. Yeah.
Yes. That I think ultimately, I mean obviously Oslo, what's happening in the last 11 months hasn't gone on for years. Obviously what's happened to Gaza, yes, started on October 7, but having been there, I mean, Gaza has been on life support for years and years and years. Nothing like it is now, of course. And in some ways, when people are sort of saying, well, Israel has not won this war because Hamas is still standing. Now, that's true. I mean, Hamas is standing. The parts of the Gaza, from my understanding, Hamas is regrouping, and not surprisingly. But ultimately, you read some of the Israeli right political figures and they say, it's been a complete success. What are you talking about? I mean, essentially, we have a military presence in Gaza, hopefully permanently, so they want. Gaza's made unlivable. It's unlivable. What's the failure? This is the logic, so-called logic, I'm saying, of the Israeli right. And with, I think, a real possibility in the coming months or years of some kind of Israeli outposts. I think that is not impossible. They're not going to build a settlement for 20,000 people next week, but as is often the case in the West Bank, it's step by step. It's outpost by outpost. 10 people here, 20 people here. And yes, the current government in Israel is encouraging that. I mean, you have two key people in the government who are openly saying we need to build settlements, outposts, whatever it looks like. There are people on the border with Gaza at the moment waiting to be allowed in to set up something. Now, obviously, the only way those people can survive within Gaza is to
be protected.
Protected by a massive military force, which would be insane. But again,
do you think that's what the goal is, to occupy parts?
I think the goal is certainly to. Yes, I think the goal of some is to build outposts or settlements. The goal is also to cut the north from the south of Gaza, which has already happened anyway with military presence. And I think Netanyahu and the Israeli government are banking on the fact that the world will kind of not pay attention at some point. They'll just sort of move on. That there'll be an election come, obviously, November. If Trump wins, it's all in. The vision of sort of hardcore outpost settlements will continue. Now, obviously, Harris is a bit of an unknown presence. I mean, I think so far she's given literally zero intention of changing any policy at all. And history, as having written about her in years past, is she's basically been a very blind pro-Israel figure. But I think there is an Israeli sense, as they have seen in the West Bank for years, patience, determination, belligerence. Because ultimately, what's the world doing about it? Nothing.
Yeah. And I think Israel knows that. I think that's, yeah.
For now. I don't want to give people the impression, there's no hope. I think, God, that's like my middle name. People go, God, your work is very grim. It's like, yeah, it's grim.
Don't invite Antony to the party.
I think I'm a pretty fun guy, actually. But it's. I think the only way, therefore, I just saw this week, the EU chief is encouraging the EU to put sanctions on Israeli government ministers. Now, that may not happen because agreement in the EU is close to impossible. But my point being that there is a shift going on. There is a growing awareness of the extremism at the heart of Israel and the Israeli government. The question is, without economic pressure, all Israel understands is economic pressure. Like with apartheid South Africa, Economic pressure and cultural isolation. It's the only way. It's the only way.
Yeah. BDS movement. Let's see what happens there. I wanted to ask you about NYU. NYU has made Zionism or Zionist a protected class. And I want to get the wording right here. They said, using code words like Zionist does not eliminate the possibility that your speech violates the non-discrimination and anti-harassment policy. For many Jewish people, Zionism is a part of their Jewish identity. How dangerous is this?
Very. And obviously we're yet to see how it's enforced, what it practically means. I mean, you can almost imagine a scenario where there's a protest, there's some Palestinian or critical anti-Zionist Jew who says something like, Israel shouldn't be a Zionist state, or shouldn't be a Jewish state, or down with Zionism, or free Palestine, or from the river to the sea, whatever. And the university investigates that person and kicks them out. It's very possible to imagine that. I think it's dangerous because it's also increasingly spreading to the possibility of that happening on social media platforms too. Meta, since October 7, has made, it's not entirely clear because with most things with these organisations, they're opaque beyond belief. You never really kind of quite know what's happening with these platforms until someone gets banned or removed, right? But this idea of potentially taking what NYU is doing to a social media platform, Meta, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, is very dangerous because, I think, look, I've long said that I think threatening anyone with physical violence it's against the law anyway, not acceptable, not okay, even if you're a Zionist, of course. I just don't support that at all. But the idea of having a legitimate, robust chat that does, for example, talk about ending Zionism is a legitimate public conversation. It's like the US, many US states, I think about 35 now, have tried to outlaw BDS. This is before October 7. I would say it's counterproductive and will fail, and I think this attempt at NYU will also fail. Other universities might follow, wouldn't surprise me. There's obviously massive pressure from Jewish organisations and Jewish donors to get universities, in their view, back on the right track after what they view as their kind of soft response to the encampments. That's how they view it. And I think you will probably find both a Trump administration and a Harris administration supporting that. That's what concerns me. I think Harris would potentially support that. Wouldn't surprise me if she did.
I think she would too. And Trump already said, I think, that I'll kick them out of the country.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm going to end with this because I've been asking a lot of people I've been speaking to these days this question, but how do you think we will look back on this time in 20, 30 years?
You mean you're talking in relation to Gaza particularly?
Yes,
or just
Not just Gaza, just the environment that we're living in right now, the sort of McCarthyism that's happening, that nobody can speak out against anything, people losing their jobs, their livelihoods, their everything. I find that there's a torrent of activity happening, and that there's so much going on, so much information coming at us that you almost can't even process things fast enough.
I mean, I'm generally a bit of a pessimist, but I want to give some optimism. But first, the pessimism. I think that McCarthyism will increase, not just around Israel-Palestine, but I do see other concerning trends of trying to shut down legitimate debate. I mean, for example, you can readily imagine if there's a Trump administration that there's going to be mass protests against, for example, what he's trying to do with immigration. He's intending to kick out, so he says, millions and millions and millions of people. Now, whether that's viable, whether that's going to happen, God knows. That's what he said he wants to do. And he's talked about calling the National Guard to deal with protests. Now, that's a pretty dark possibility within literally a matter of months. Now, it may not happen. He may not win. I think, though, that people will look back, though, at this period with both admiration and profound shame. Shame that there is global awareness on a scale that is unprecedented in history about what's happening in Palestine. We know what's going on. We're seeing the footage and we're hearing the stories. And some of us, I have friends from Gaza who have come out, who have escaped. Some of them are now in Australia, friends of mine. Some of whom, of course, are not. And the fact that there was a inability to get that massive social movement campaign to deeply impact policy. That is the shame. That there are huge protests, some countries as big as, or close to as big as the protests against the Iraq War, 2002 and 3, and yet most governments were not movable. They weren't. They kept sending weapons. And is that a failure on our part? Well, how can it not be? Of course it is. It's a failure. Now, I think we could argue that it's also, we look back with the fact that the question is what we do with this awareness. What do we do with this momentum towards trying to end what's happening in Gaza or, frankly, Palestine itself? Is that harnessed into campaigns and movements, or does it kind of dissipate? And that's up to us. The challenge is to take that, because obviously the internet, on the one hand, is incredibly empowering. On the other hand, as we know, can also be incredibly disempowering, because people are in their own little silos, in their own homes, on their phones, whatever. How do you take that in a much more organised way? There is still a desperate need. We cannot, in my view, change the world simply through online campaigns. We just can't. And that's important.
It's not enough. Yeah.
It's not enough. So I guess I think people will look back with a combination, hopefully, of some pride that there was a lot of us were trying to raise the alarm, but also I think of, almost certainly, I feel this already now, of shame.
Yeah.
And frustration. And finally, I hope within the Jewish community, not that one can generalize, but in the Jewish diaspora, that the Jewish supremacists become a tiny minority, because there are pro-genocide, pro-Jewish supremacist Jewish communities. Frankly, virtually every mainstream Jewish group in America supports what Israel's doing. Let's be honest. I suspect Canada and, frankly, Australia is the same. Now, is that going to be the same in 15, 20 years? There'll be obviously other groups, dissident groups, critical groups. But are those Jewish dissidents, are they growing in number or are they not? And I hope with me and others we're trying to build that momentum of saying it's not a Jewish value to support starving Palestinians. Because if you believe it is, you're not a Jew. You're not a person. You're a monster. And I worry that there are too many Jewish people still who are able to block out the noise or the reality of what Israel is doing and frame it, as I said right at the beginning, it's us and them. It's us and them. If we don't kill them, they're going to kill us. So I'm sorry, it's a bit messy, but what can you do?
Beware the native.
Indeed.
Yeah. I think we'll end there. Thank you so much, Antony.
Thank you.